blood on a custom Italian rug smells surprisingly like copper and spilled pennies. Maeve scrubbed it anyway, ignoring the 12 men in bespoke suits shouting in 4 different dialects above her head. They were failing. Miserably. 12 expensive interpreters had already cracked under the pressure of the Don's interrogation. None of them realized the woman wringing out dirty water from a cheap yellow sponge understood every single threat. Lie, and unspoken death sentence echoing across the boardroom. Ammonia burns the inside of the nostrils. It's a sharp, synthetic smell, aggressive enough to strip the wax off a hardwood floor and strong enough to keep a tired mind awake. Maeve knelt on the edge of a hand-woven Persian rug, a plastic bucket of murky grey water by her right thigh. Her knees throbbed. A dull, grinding ache radiated up her shins, the cartilage protesting after 6 hours of a double shift. She was 31, but the industrial lighting of the 42nd floor boardroom made her feel 50. Above her, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, stale espresso, and the sharp, sour tang of male sweat. The men in the room did not notice her. To them, she was a fixture of the architecture, a low, humming appliance dressed in a faded navy blue smock. At the center of the room sat a massive mahogany table. It looked like an altar. Currently, it was serving as a battlefield. On one side sat Dominic Rossi. Dominic didn't look like the mob bosses in the movies. He didn't wear fedoras or chew on unlit cigars. He wore a charcoal suit tailored so precisely it looked like armor. His face was all sharp angles and exhausted shadows, his dark eyes fixed on the man across from him. He was terrifying because he was entirely still. He didn't fidget. He didn't tap his fingers. He just stared. On the other side sat Grigory. Grigory was a mountain of a man wrapped in a suit that cost more than Maeve's life insurance policy, yet somehow still looked cheap. He was Chechen, but he ran his operations out of a fractured border town where 4 different languages bled into one another. He spoke in a rapid, guttural avalanche of syllables. Between them stood Charles. Charles was the 12th interpreter of the evening. Maeve had been quietly scrubbing the baseboards since 9 p.m. It was now 2:15 a.m. She had watched the previous 11 professionals fail in real time. The first had been an academic, a man who spoke textbook Russian. He lasted 10 minutes before Grigory slipped into an obscure Georgian prison slang, completely bypassing the man's vocabulary. The academic stuttered, apologized, and was promptly shoved out the door by one of Dominic's guards. The 4th interpreter, a woman who specialized in Eastern European dialects, started crying when Dominic calmly threatened to remove Grigory's fingers. She couldn't stomach the words. The 9th interpreter was dragged out by his collar. He had tried to soften Grigory's words, a fatal mistake. Dominic didn't want diplomacy. He wanted accuracy. Now Charles was drowning. Charles was sweating so profusely that dark half-moon stained the armpits of his crisp white shirt. He kept pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. They immediately slid back down his slick skin. "Mr. Rossi," Charles stammered, his voice vibrating with a high-frequency tremor. He says that the shipment at the docks was delayed due to structural complications." Maeve paused her scrubbing. Her coarse, bristled brush hovered an inch above a spilled drop of espresso. Structural complications. She nearly rolled her eyes. Grigory hadn't said anything about structural complications. Grigory had used a highly specific, deeply vulgar idiom in a fractured dialect of Romany mixed with Russian. What he had actually said was closer to, "Your men are toothless dogs who let the cargo rot while they played with themselves." Maeve knew this because she had spent 3 years scrubbing floors in a refugee processing center in Marseille, where that exact dialect was spat daily in the courtyards. She had learned languages not in air-conditioned classrooms, but in the gutters, the shelters, and the transit trains of a fractured youth. She knew 8 languages fluently, and could navigate 4 more. She didn't know them because she was a genius. She knew them because when you are invisible, people talk. And when you are vulnerable, understanding what the people who want to hurt you are saying is the only way to survive. She dipped her brush back into the grey water. "Keep your head down," she told herself. "Just clean the damn floor." Grigori slammed a heavy fist onto the mahogany. The wood shuddered. Ice clinked violently against crystal in a half-empty glass of scotch. He unleashed another torrent of words. The syllables were heavy, rolling with R's and sharp with hard K's. Dominic's jaw twitched. Just a millimeter. But Maeve saw it. "Translate," Dominic said. His voice was quiet. It scraped against the silent room like sandpaper. Charles swallowed hard. The sound was audible. He says that the price must be renegotiated to reflect the inconvenience." Maeve squeezed the yellow sponge. Dirty water cascaded into the bucket with a hollow splash. "Wrong again, Charles," she thought, her back aching as she shifted her weight. Grigori had just told Dominic that if he didn't pay an extra 20%, Grigori's men would burn the warehouse to the ground with Dominic's brother inside it. The gap between what was being said and what was being translated wasn't just a miscommunication. It was a fuse burning its way toward a powder keg. And Maeve was sitting right in the middle of the blast radius. The air conditioning kicked on with a low mechanical hum, blowing cold air down the back of Maeve's neck. It didn't help. The room felt suffocatingly hot. Dominic leaned forward slowly. The leather of his chair groaned. It was a subtle sound, but it made Charles flinch. "Inconvenience," Dominic repeated. The word tasted foul in his mouth. "He's asking for a renegotiation because of an inconvenience." "Yes, sir," Charles whispered. Grigori watched the exchange, a smug, oily smile spreading across his thick lips. He didn't speak English well, but he understood power dynamics perfectly. He knew the interpreter was terrified. He knew he was getting away with murder, hiding behind the barrier of language. Grigori leaned back, crossing his arms over his barrel chest. He looked at Dominic, then looked away dismissively, muttering something under his breath. It was a quick, off-handed comment in a bastardized Sicilian street slang, a dialect he likely picked up from rival factions just to mock them. "Lu Sheku fa finta di essere un leone." The room went dead silent. Dominic didn't speak Sicilian natively. He was 3rd generation, his Italian restricted to food and curses. But he caught the tone. He looked at Charles. Charles froze. He clearly didn't speak Sicilian either. His expertise was likely restricted to Slavic languages. The panic in Charles's eyes shifted from professional anxiety to primal terror. "What did he say?" Dominic asked. The quietness of his voice was completely gone, replaced by a cold, metallic edge. I specialize in Russian, Mr. Rossi. That wasn't Russian." "I don't care what it wasn't. What did he say?" Grigori laughed. It was a wet, phlegmy sound. He poured himself another 2 fingers of scotch, deliberately ignoring Dominic. Maeve's heart hammered against her ribs. The rhythm was erratic, painful. "Don't do it," she thought. "Keep scrubbing. You get paid $15 an hour. This is not a $15 an hour problem." She knew exactly what Grigori had said. The donkey pretends to be a lion. It was an insult to Dominic's bloodline, to his authority. Dominic stood up. The movement was so fluid it was predatory. He reached inside his tailored jacket. The sound of fabric sliding against steel was unmistakable. When Dominic's hand emerged, he was holding a matte black pistol. He didn't point it at Grigori. He didn't point it at Charles. He simply placed it flat on the mahogany table. Clack! The metal against the polished wood echoed like a gavel. "Charles," Dominic said, his eyes never leaving Grigory. You are my 12th interpreter tonight. The last 11 failed because they were either incompetent or they thought they could spare my feelings. I don't have feelings, Charles. I have cargo and I have money. Now I am going to ask you one last time. What did the fat man say? Charles was hyperventilating. His chest heaved. I swear to God, Mr. Rossi, I don't know the dialect. It sounded Italian, but the morphology... I don't need a linguistics lecture. Dominic picked up the gun. He didn't aim it. He just weighed it in his palm. I need words. Grigory, sensing the shift, decided to double down. He spoke again, this time in Russian, his voice booming with arrogant authority. He pointed a thick, stubby finger at Dominic. Charles seized the lifeline, desperate to translate something, anything. He says that you are being unreasonable and that your aggression is bad for business. Maeve's knee gave out. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity of the lie. Maybe it was the sudden drop in her blood sugar. But her right knee buckled. She slipped. Her hand slammed against the plastic rim of the bucket to catch her balance. The bucket tipped. A gallon of dirty, grey, ammonia-laced water flooded across the pristine Persian rug. Splash! The sound was deafening in the tense silence of the room. Maeve gasped, a sharp intake of air as the cold water soaked through her jeans, chilling her skin. Shit! She hissed under her breath. All 12 men in the room snapped their heads toward her. For 3 excruciating seconds, nobody moved. The smell of ammonia intensified, rising from the soaked wool of the rug. Maeve stayed frozen on her hands and knees, staring at the spreading, dark stain of the water. Her pulse was a drumbeat in her ears. Dominic stared at her. His face was unreadable. Grigory scowled, irritated by the interruption. He looked at Maeve, taking in her faded smock, her messy hair pulled into a cheap claw clip, her wet knees. He scoffed, leaned over to his second-in-command, and muttered a rapid, vicious sentence in French. Regarde cette truie. C'est pour ça que ce pays est une poubelle. Look at this sow. This is why this country is a garbage can. It was the final straw. Maeve was tired. She was hungry. Her back felt like it was splitting in two, and she now had to spend another hour extracting dirty water out of a rug she had just spent 2 hours cleaning. She didn't have the emotional bandwidth left to be insulted by a man who smelled like cheap sausage and expensive cologne. Before her survival instinct could hit the brakes, her mouth opened. She didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the spilled water, grabbed her sponge, and wrung it out with violent, trembling force. Au moins, la truie sait comment se laver. Maeve snapped, her voice raspy from disuse, perfectly hitting the guttural Parisian R. Contrairement au porc qui empeste la pièce. At least the sow knows how to wash herself, unlike the pig stinking up the room. The silence that followed didn't just fall over the room, it crushed it. If a pin had dropped, it would have sounded like a bomb. Charles stopped breathing. Dominic's hand hovered, frozen, inches above the table. Grigory's face went slack. The smugness dripped off his features, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. He stared at the woman on the floor, as if the yellow sponge in her hand had just sprouted a mouth and spoken. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut. Stupid, stupid, stupid! She squeezed the sponge so hard her knuckles turned white. The dirty water trickled over her fingers. It felt cold and real, grounding her against the terrifying reality of what she had just done. She braced herself for the shout, or the gunshot, or the rough hands of a guard pulling her up by her hair. Instead, she heard a slow, deliberate scrape of a chair. Dominic lowered the gun. He tilted his head, his dark eyes locking onto Maeve. The exhaustion in his face had vanished, replaced by a sudden, terrifying intensity. You speak French. Dominic said. It wasn't a question. Maeve kept her head down. She grabbed a dry rag from her cart and started dabbing frantically at the flooded rug. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, her voice shaking. "I'll clean it up. I'll stay off the clock. You won't be billed for the extra time." "Look at me," Dominic commanded. It wasn't a yell. It was an order, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been told no in his adult life. Maeve swallowed the lump of panic in her throat. Slowly, her aching joints popping, she sat back on her heels and looked up. Dominic's gaze was dissecting her. He looked at her cheap uniform, the dark circles under her eyes, her calloused, chemical-burned hands. Then he looked at Grigory, whose face was rapidly turning the color of an overripe plum. Grigory barked something in Chechen, pointing at Maeve, his voice rising in panic and fury. Dominic didn't look away from Maeve. "What did he just say?" Maeve hesitated. She looked at Charles. The interpreter was plastered against the wall, looking like he wanted to phase through the drywall. "I asked you a question," Dominic said smoothly. "What did he say?" Maeve's voice cracked. She cleared her throat. The sharp smell of the ammonia grounded her. "He said you run a sloppy house, that your security is a joke if a peasant can spy on a private meeting." Dominic's jaw set. Is that what he said? Yes. Grigory, realizing that his linguistic shield was shattering, slammed his fist on the table again. He switched back to Russian, shouting violently, spittle flying from his lips. He gestured towards the door, towards his men, towards the table. "Translate," Dominic ordered Maeve. "I'm just the cleaner," Maeve whispered, her chest tight. "Please, I just want to finish my shift." "If you don't translate what he is saying right now," Dominic said, leaning forward, "I am going to assume you are an asset planted by his cartel, and we will take you to the basement. Do you want to see the basement?" The threat was delivered without malice. It was purely transactional. Maeve looked into Dominic's eyes and saw the absolute truth of his words. He would do it. She let out a long, ragged sigh. The fear suddenly morphed into a deep, bone-weary irritation. She dropped the wet rag into the bucket. She grabbed the edge of the heavy mahogany table and pulled herself up. Her knee gave a loud pop that echoed in the quiet room. She stood there, 5'4", smelling of industrial bleach, her jeans soaked with dirty water, facing down some of the most dangerous men on the eastern seaboard. "Fine," Maeve said. Her voice lost its tremble. It went flat, deadened by years of surviving men exactly like the ones in this room. She turned to look directly at Grigory. "He isn't complaining about your security," Maeve said, pointing a damp, pruned finger at the Chechen boss. "He's panicking. Earlier, when your guy Charles here—" She gestured vaguely to the sweating man in the corner. "Told you that the docks had structural complications? That was a lie." Charles let out a pathetic squeak. "What did he actually say?" Dominic asked, his voice dangerously soft. "He said your men are toothless dogs." Maeve translated flawlessly without blinking. "He said they let the shipment sit and rot while they played with themselves. And 5 minutes ago, when he asked for a renegotiation—" She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "He didn't ask for a renegotiation. He demanded a 20% tax. If you don't pay it, he said his men will burn your warehouse down with your brother inside it." The temperature in the room plummeted. Dominic's underboss, a man named Arthur, who had been standing silently by the door, physically stepped forward, his hand slipping inside his jacket. Grigory's eyes widened. He realized instantly that his exact words had been laid bare. He stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. He shouted in a frantic, overlapping mix of Russian and the obscure Romani dialect. "Lies! She's a stupid whore! She doesn't know what she's talking about!" Grigory roared, assuming she wouldn't catch the rapid-fire slang. Maeve didn't wait for Dominic to ask. She turned to Grigory. Her eyes were hard, the cynical survivor in her fully surfacing. Je ne suis pas une pute. Maeve fired back in French, knowing it would throw him off rhythm. Then she seamlessly switched to the precise Romani dialect he had just used. Temerel tire de descomuj. You think you're the only one who spent time in the dirt. Your accent is garbage. You sound like a tourist. Grigory looked as if he had been physically struck. He took a step back, his mouth opening and closing silently. Dominic stared at Maeve. The gun was still resting on the table, but the tension in Dominic's shoulders had vanished. A slow, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of his mouth. He looked at Charles. Charles. The interpreter jolted. Yes, Mr. Rossi. Get the hell out of my building. Charles didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled for the door, his leather shoes slipping on the marble threshold as he vanished into the hallway. Dominic looked back at Maeve. She was standing awkwardly, water dripping from her pant leg onto the floor. She looked exhausted, irritated, and entirely out of place. What's your name? Dominic asked. Maeve, she said, wrapping her arms around her stomach. Look, I translated. Are we done? The floor is going to warp if I don't get the water up. Dominic ignored the question. He pointed to the empty, plush leather chair that Charles had just vacated. Sit down, Maeve. Dominic said. I'm dirty. She replied instinctively. I'll ruin the leather. I don't care about the leather. Dominic said. He picked up his gun, checked the safety with a metallic click, and placed it back in his holster. He looked at Grigory, his eyes cold and dead, before turning his gaze back to the woman with the yellow sponge. Sit down, Dominic repeated. We have a negotiation to finish, and you're going to tell me exactly what this fat pig is thinking. Maeve looked at the chair. She looked at her bucket. She looked at the 12 men staring at her, waiting. She let out another long sigh, the cartilage in her knee burning. Do I get a raise for this? She asked. Dominic actually laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of sound that seemed to shock his own men. Yeah, Maeve, Dominic said, pulling out the chair for her. You get a raise. The leather of the chair was buttery and warm, retaining the nervous body heat of the interpreter who had just fled. Maeve hated it instantly. The damp, cold denim of her soaked jeans clung to her thighs, creating a miserable friction against the expensive upholstery. She sat stiffly, perching on the edge. Her right knee throbbed a steady, rhythmic pulse in time with her heart. Grigory was staring at her with the kind of primal hatred usually reserved for a blood enemy, not a janitor. Start, Dominic said. He leaned back in his own chair, steepling his fingers. He looked completely relaxed, but it was the relaxation of a coiled spring. Grigory did not want to speak to her. He glared at Dominic, pointing a thick finger at Maeve. You let the help sit at the table? He sneered in Russian. Maeve didn't wait. He's insulting your hospitality, she said, her voice flat. He's calling me the help and acting offended that I'm in a chair. Grigory's jaw snapped shut. The realization that his words were no longer his private sanctuary settled over him like a physical weight. He shifted his bulk, the chair groaning under him. He switched tactics, dropping the booming aggression for a low, rapid-fire Albanian. It was a northern dialect, harsh and clipped, full of swallowed vowels. This changes nothing. The tax remains. The docks are mine. You think because you found a stray dog that barks on command, I will surrender my leverage? Maeve absorbed the words. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. The smell of ammonia was still sharp in the air, mixing nauseatingly with Grigory's heavy musk and the metallic tang of adrenaline coating the back of her tongue. She opened her eyes and looked at Dominic. He switched to Albanian. Maeve said, "A northern dialect. He's trying to hide behind geography now. He says the 20% tax remains. He claims he controls the docks, and that finding me doesn't change his leverage." Dominic's eyes flicked to Grigory. "Tell him he doesn't control the docks. The union does. And I bought the union president a house in Boca last year." Maeve turned to Grigory. She didn't just translate the words. She translated the quiet, lethal confidence in Dominic's tone. She spoke the Albanian smoothly, wrapping her tongue around the sharp consonants. "Aita se syndicata kontrollon docket. De aie bleu presidentin e syndicate." Grigory's eyes darted between them. The bluff was called. The gap in his armor had been forced open by a woman who, 10 minutes ago, he hadn't even perceived as a human being. He leaned across the table, his massive shoulders hunching. He spoke softly, directly to Maeve, in a bastardized Romani slang again. The words were laced with venom. "I will find out where you sleep, little bird. I will cut that tongue out of your head and feed it to the strays." Maeve's breath hitched. A cold spike of genuine, paralyzing fear drove itself into her stomach. It was one thing to be brave in the heat of the moment. It was another to have a cartel boss promise you a gruesome death in a language only the two of you understood. Her hands, resting in her lap, began to tremble. She pressed them hard against her thighs, trying to stop the shaking. Dominic caught the movement. His dark eyes locked onto her pale face. "What did he say?" Maeve swallowed. Her throat was bone dry. She hesitated. The instinct to survive screamed at her to soften the translation, to do exactly what the last 11 men had done. Lie. Deflect. Save yourself. But she looked at the dark stain on the Persian rug. She looked at the bucket of dirty water. She remembered the 6 hours of scrubbing, the aching joints, the invisible life she led. If she backed down now, she was just a target. If she pushed forward, she was a weapon. "He threatened me," Maeve said, her voice shaking slightly, but loud enough to carry. "He said he's going to find out where I sleep and cut my tongue out." Arthur, the underboss, standing by the door, took a single heavy step forward. Dominic didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared at Grigory for a long, terrible moment. Then, very slowly, Dominic smiled. It was a terrifying expression. It didn't reach his eyes. "Grigory," Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave. "You don't threaten my employees in my building." Maeve stared at him. "My employees." The possessiveness in the phrase sent a weird, contradictory shiver down her spine. It wasn't protective. It was territorial. She was a piece of his furniture now, a very useful, very vulnerable piece of furniture. "Tell him," Dominic instructed Maeve, never breaking eye contact with the Chechen, "that the tax is 0. The shipment moves tonight. If he delays it by 1 more hour, I won't burn his warehouse. I'll just send his ledger to the FBI field office in Manhattan. I know about the skimming he's doing from his cousins in Grozny." Maeve's eyebrows shot up. She didn't know the context, but she knew a kill shot when she heard one. She relayed the message in Russian, keeping her voice as icy and devoid of emotion as Dominic's. Grigory's face drained of color. The deep, ruddy plum turned into a sickly, mottled gray. The mention of his cousins in Grozny hit him like a physical blow. He stared at Dominic, his chest heaving, the bluster completely punctured. He didn't say another word. He stood up, knocking his chair back. He threw a look of pure, concentrated venom at Maeve, then turned and marched out of the boardroom. His 3 silent bodyguards shadowed him, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind them. The silence rushed back into the room, thick and heavy. For 10 seconds, nobody spoke. The low hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Then the adrenaline left Maeve's body all at once. It wasn't a slow fade. It was a sudden, sickening drop. Her vision swam. The edges of the room blurred. The metallic taste in her mouth turned to ash. She slumped forward slightly, her forearms resting on her damp knees. She let out a shaky breath that sounded suspiciously like a sob, though her eyes were completely dry. She stood up abruptly. Her knee popped again. She swayed, caught her balance on the edge of the table, and limped directly toward her yellow bucket. "What are you doing?" Dominic asked. "The water," Maeve muttered, her voice tight. "It's seeping into the floorboards. The wax is going to peel." She dropped to her knees. The pain in her joints was excruciating, but it was real. It was a familiar, manageable pain. She plunged her bare hands into the cold, filthy water, grabbing the sponge and squeezing it out with frantic, jerky motions. It was a pathetic, irrational coping mechanism, but she couldn't stop. If she stopped cleaning, she would have to process the fact that she had just made an enemy of a Chechen mob boss. Dominic stood up. He walked around the table. His custom Italian leather shoes made almost no sound on the hardwood border. He stopped right beside her, kneeling form. "Arthur," Dominic said, not looking away from Maeve. "Get rid of the bucket." "Yes, boss." Arthur walked over. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, with a face that looked like it had been reconstructed from memory. He reached down and grabbed the metal handle of the bucket. "No, wait!" Maeve protested, her hands dripping grey water onto the floor. "I have to finish my section?" Arthur lifted the bucket effortlessly and walked out of the room. Maeve stayed on her knees, her hands empty, hovering over the damp rug. She felt ridiculous. She looked ridiculous. "Get up, Maeve," Dominic said gently. It was the first time his tone hadn't been an absolute command. She wiped her wet, dirty hands on her wet, dirty jeans. She pushed herself up, refusing to look him in the eye. She stared at the subtle pinstripes of his charcoal trousers. "You're shaking," he observed. "I have a low blood sugar problem." She lied. Her voice cracked. Dominic walked over to the sidebar. Crystal clinked against glass. He returned a moment later and held out a tumbler filled with 2 fingers of amber liquid. Maeve looked at it. "I don't drink on shift." "Your shift is over," Dominic said. "Take the glass." She took it. Her hands were shaking so badly the ice rattled against the sides. She brought it to her lips and took a sip. It was scotch. It burned a fiery path down her throat, settling hot and heavy in her empty stomach. She coughed, squeezing her eyes shut. "Where did you learn to speak Romani slang with a Marseille accent?" Dominic asked. Maeve opened her eyes. The alcohol was already doing its job, dulling the sharp edges of her panic. She looked at him. Really looked at him. Up close, Dominic Rossi looked exhausted. There were fine lines around his eyes, and the shadow of a dark beard was pushing through his jawline. He didn't look like a cartoon villain. He looked like a CEO who operated in a very bloody market. "Refugee transit centers," Maeve said, her voice raspy from the liquor. "I cleaned the floors there too. When you're sweeping the corners of a room filled with people who have lost everything, you hear things. People don't care if the cleaner hears them. They assume you're deaf, stupid, or both." 8 languages, Dominic noted. "That's what you said. Is that true?" "Fluent in 8. I can order a meal, swear, and bribe a border guard in 4 others." Dominic studied her. He looked at the calluses on her hands, the cheap plastic clip holding up her dark, messy hair, the way she carried her shoulders, hunched, defensive, ready for a blow. "You're wasted on a mop," he said simply. "It pays the rent." Maeve shot back, a spark of cynicism flaring up. "Mostly?" and nobody threatens to cut my tongue out for wiping down a sink. Dominic took a slow sip of his own drink. Grigori won't touch you. You're under my umbrella now. I don't want to be under your umbrella, Maeve said, handing him back the half-empty glass. It rains blood under your umbrella. I just want my paycheck and a bus pass home. How much do you make a week, Maeve? She crossed her arms, defensive. 400. 5 if I pick up the weekend graveyard shift. Dominic pulled a slim, silver money clip from his pocket. He peeled off a stack of crisp $100 bills. He didn't count them. He just held them out. It looked like at least $3,000. This is your bonus for tonight, Dominic said. Tomorrow you quit the cleaning agency. You come work for me. Maeve stared at the money. It was more than she had in her savings account. It was enough to fix the radiator in her apartment. It was enough to buy groceries that didn't come out of a discounted, dented can. Internal contradiction clawed at her. Her brain told her to run, to take the bus back to Queens, lock her deadbolt, and never look back. But her pride, her exhaustion, and the bitter reality of poverty told her to take the damn money. She didn't reach for it. Doing what? I'm not a criminal. I don't need you to pull a trigger, Dominic said. I need ears. I need someone who understands not just the words, but the culture behind the words. My enemies hide behind dialects. You are going to strip them naked. Maeve bit the inside of her cheek. I don't wash blood. You won't have to, Dominic said, his eyes locking onto hers. You're going to help me prevent it from spilling. She knew it was a lie, or at best a half-truth, but the exhaustion in her bones won out over her morality. She reached out and took the money. The paper felt crisp and dangerous in her damp hand. I want health insurance, Maeve blurted out. Dominic blinked, surprised. Then that small, imperceptible smirk returned to the corner of his mouth. Done. Dental too. Don't push your luck, Maeve. 72 hours later, Maeve was standing in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror in a penthouse suite overlooking Central Park. She felt like an imposter wrapped in armor. Gone were the faded navy smock and the waterlogged jeans. She was wearing a tailored charcoal pantsuit crafted from a wool so fine it felt like liquid against her skin. A silk blouse, the color of crushed pearls, rested coolly against her collarbones. It was beautiful. It was expensive. It was suffocating. The clothes felt like a lie. They didn't smell like bleach and honest sweat. They smelled like new fabric and unspoken expectations. She shifted her weight, wincing as the pointed toe of her stiletto pinched the widest part of her foot. She had spent a decade in orthopedic, rubber-soled work shoes. These heels felt like medieval torture devices. The heavy oak door of the bedroom clicked open. Dominic walked in. He was dressed in a dark navy suit today, a crisp white shirt open at the collar. He stopped in the center of the room, adjusting his cuffs, and looked at her. He didn't offer a compliment. There was no sweeping, romantic gaze. His assessment was purely clinical, like a mechanic checking the alignment of a sports car before a race. The jacket pulls slightly at the shoulders when you cross your arms. Dominic noted, his voice smooth and detached. Tell the tailor to let it out a quarter inch. You need to look comfortable, not constrained. Maeve dropped her arms to her sides. I'd be more comfortable if I wasn't balancing on metal spikes. Who am I trying to impress? The floorboards? Dominic walked toward a mahogany credenza and poured a glass of sparkling water. You're not dressing to impress. You're dressing to belong. If you look like a cleaner, they treat you like a cleaner. If you look like you own the room, they hesitate. Hesitation is where we win. He handed her the glass. She took it, careful not to let their fingers brush. The air between them crackled with a strange static. It wasn't sexual tension, not yet, anyway. It was the friction of two entirely different worlds grinding against each other. She was chaos and survival. He was control and power. "Who are we meeting?" Maeve asked, taking a sip. The water tasted metallic. Or maybe that was just her nerves. "The Calabrians," Dominic said. He turned and leaned against the credenza, his dark eyes fixed on her. "Specifically, my uncle, Vincenzo. He controls the import routes coming through the southern ports." Maeve frowned. "You need an interpreter for your own uncle. Vincenzo speaks perfect English," Dominic said, his jaw tightening slightly. "But he thinks I don't speak the old dialect. He uses it with his capos when he wants to speak openly in front of me. He thinks I'm a modern businessman, stripped of the old ways." "Are you?" Dominic looked at her. The exhaustion she had seen 3 nights ago was gone, replaced by a cold, impenetrable mask. "I'm whatever I need to be to keep my seat at the table. Vincenzo has been shorting our supply chains for 6 months. He blames customs. I need to know what he's actually saying when he thinks I'm deaf." Maeve set the glass down. The ice clinked. "So I'm not negotiating today. I'm a spy." "You're an analyst," Dominic corrected smoothly. "Call it what you want, Rossi. If your uncle catches me listening, he won't be as easily intimidated as the Chechen." "He won't catch you." Dominic walked toward the door, pausing with his hand on the brass handle. "You're going to sit quietly, take notes on a tablet, and look like a highly overpaid executive assistant. When they speak the dialect, you translate it in your head. When we leave, you tell me everything." Maeve looked at her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked sharp, dangerous, and completely alien. "What if he doesn't say anything incriminating?" she asked. "What if he really is having customs issues?" Dominic let out a harsh, cynical breath. "In this family, Maeve, everyone is guilty of something. Your job is just to find out exactly what." 20 minutes later, they were in the back of an armored SUV, gliding silently through the Manhattan traffic. The interior smelled of rich leather and the subtle, peppery scent of Dominic's cologne. The tinted windows turned the bright afternoon sun into a muted, cinematic glow. Maeve sat as far away from Dominic as the wide back seat allowed. She stared out the window, watching the pedestrians rush by. People in old coats, carrying cheap coffee, worrying about rent and train schedules. 3 days ago, she was one of them. Now she was separated from them by 2 inches of bulletproof glass and a $50,000 wardrobe. She felt a sudden, profound wave of loneliness. "You're grinding your teeth," Dominic said, not looking up from his phone. Maeve unclenched her jaw. "Sorry, the altitude up here is giving me a headache." Dominic locked his screen and turned his head to look at her. The muted light caught the sharp angles of his face. "You regret taking the money?" "I regret that the money was necessary," she shot back honestly. She turned to face him, the cynicism raw in her voice. "Don't pretend you're doing me a favor, Dominic. You bought a tool. I sold out. Let's just keep the transaction clear." Dominic's eyes narrowed. For a second, a flash of something unpredictable crossed his face. Anger, maybe, or begrudging respect. "Fair enough," Dominic said quietly. "But tools get put back in the box when the job is done. You're sitting at the table." Before Maeve could respond, the SUV slowed to a halt. The heavy locks clicked open. They were parked outside a nondescript social club in Little Italy. The brick facade was weathered, the windows dark. 2 men in oversized coats stood by the door, trying and failing to look casual. Dominic stepped out first. He didn't wait for the driver to open Maeve's door. He opened it himself, offering a hand. Maeve looked at his outstretched hand. The calluses on his knuckles were faint, but they were there. A reminder that his power wasn't just inherited. It had been earned in blood. She ignored his hand and stepped out onto the pavement, her stilettos clicking sharply against the concrete. "Lead the way, boss," she said, pulling her jacket tight against the chill. Dominic dropped his hand. A ghost of a smile played on his lips. He turned and walked toward the heavy wooden doors of the club. Maeve followed, the smell of cheap cigars and stale espresso wafting out to meet them, dragging her back into the dark. The Mulberry Society did not look like a place where millions of dollars in illicit cargo were negotiated. It looked like a place where old men came to die of cholesterol. As Maeve stepped through the heavy wooden doors, the smell hit her like a physical blow. It was a suffocating blend of stale cigar smoke, bitter espresso, and the sharp, licorice tang of anisette. The lighting was a jaundiced yellow, casting long, bruised shadows against walls lined with faded photographs of men who had likely been dead for decades. Her eyes immediately dragged towards the floor. The linoleum near the brass footrail of the bar was peeling, revealing a dark, sticky underlayer of years-old grime. A phantom ache twinged in her right knee. She forced her gaze up, gripping the leather-bound tablet Dominic had handed her earlier. Dominic moved through the room with the effortless glide of a shark in familiar waters. He didn't swagger. He didn't have to. The half-dozen men scattered at the small, round tables immediately stopped talking as he passed, a collective holding of breath that Maeve felt in her own chest. At the back of the room, sitting beneath a massive, unlit television, was Vincenzo. He was a thick, bull-necked man in his late 60s, wearing a track jacket over a collared shirt, a bizarre clash of leisure and formality. A napkin was tucked into his collar, catching drops of red sauce from the plate of veal in front of him. Next to him stood a younger man with slicked-back hair and dead reptilian eyes. "Dominic!" Vincenzo boomed, his voice a gravelly baritone that rattled the espresso cups on his table. He didn't stand up. "You're late. The veal is getting rubbery." "Traffic, uncle," Dominic said smoothly, pulling out a chair opposite the older man. He didn't look at the food. Vincenzo's dark eyes flicked to Maeve. He looked her up and down, a slow, greasy assessment that made her skin crawl beneath the expensive silk of her blouse. He lingered on her face, then dismissed her completely. "You brought a secretary to a family meeting?" Vincenzo asked, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "What, you don't trust your own memory anymore?" "She's an analyst," Dominic said, his tone entirely neutral. "I'm restructuring the back office. She takes notes. Ignore her." Maeve pulled out a chair slightly behind and to the left of Dominic, sitting with perfect, rigid posture. She placed the tablet on her lap and unlocked it. Her hands were steady, but her pulse was vibrating against her collarbone. "Fine. Let her type." Vincenzo grunted, leaning forward. The leather of his chair squeaked. "We have a problem with the Port Authority in Newark. The inspectors are holding up container 404. They want another 20 grand to look the other way. It's eating into my margins, Dom." Dominic steepled his fingers. "Your margins? Or the family's margins? We all bleed when the docks get squeezed." Vincenzo countered quickly, a little too loudly. "I'm telling you, it's the new Oversight Committee. They're crawling up my ass with a flashlight. I need authorization to pull funds from the discretionary account to grease the wheels." Maeve typed rapidly on the tablet. She wasn't transcribing the conversation. She was typing the lyrics to a French pop song she had heard on the radio 3 years ago, keeping up the illusion of a diligent assistant. Dominic sighed, a perfectly calculated sound of bureaucratic frustration. "I'll look at the ledgers, but the customs delays need to end, Vincenzo. It makes us look weak to the buyers." Vincenzo nodded, his face a mask of solemn agreement. "Of course, it's a temporary headache." Then Vincenzo leaned back, broke eye contact with Dominic, and looked up at the slick-haired man standing beside him. When Vincenzo spoke again, The rhythm of his voice changed completely. The crisp, American-accented English vanished. He slipped into a thick, choked Calabrian dialect. It was a dying language, heavy with swallowed vowels and sharp, guttural stops. It sounded less like a language and more like stones grinding against each other. The kid is getting anxious, Vincenzo muttered in the dialect, picking his teeth with a thumbnail. Tell the Lupertazzi crew the weapons are clear. The Port Authority story bought us another week. Maeve didn't miss a beat. She kept typing. Je ne veux pas travailler. Je ne veux pas déjeuner. Her face remained a completely blank canvas, but her blood ran cold. Weapons. The young man, the capo, nodded slightly and replied in the same dense dialect. What about the container? Should we move the rifles to the safe house? Tonight. Vincenzo replied. Before the dinner on Thursday. Once we sit down to eat, we strike. The nephew won't leave the table breathing, and the ports are finally mine. Maeve's fingers slipped on the glass screen of the tablet. She hit the edge of the device, creating a sharp, plastic clack that cut through the low murmur of the room. Vincenzo stopped picking his teeth. He turned his heavy, scarred head towards her, his eyes narrowing into two dark, suspicious slits. The room went completely silent. Maeve didn't look up. She frowned at the screen, tapped the backspace key a few times with exaggerated annoyance, and let out a soft, exasperated sigh. "Apologies, Mr. Rossi," she said, her voice perfectly pitched to sound like a mildly irritated corporate drone. The syncing software crashed again. Dominic didn't turn around. "Fix it, Maeve, and do it quietly." "Yes, sir." Vincenzo stared at her for 3 more agonizing seconds. Maeve could feel his gaze burning into the top of her skull. She kept her eyes glued to the screen, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She forced her shoulders to relax, playing the part of the bored, stressed assistant who cared more about her IT issues than the men in the room. Slowly, Vincenzo grunted, turning his attention back to Dominic. He switched back to English. "Get better help, Dom. The digital crap is rotting your brain." "I'll keep that in mind, Uncle," Dominic said, standing up. "I'll approve the 20 grand for customs. Let me know when the container clears." "Always, nephew." Vincenzo smiled. It was a broad, wet, fatherly smile. "See you at the family dinner on Thursday." "Thursday." Dominic agreed. He turned and walked towards the door. Maeve stood up, clutching the tablet to her chest, and followed him out into the blinding afternoon sun, taking Vincenzo's death sentence with her. The armored doors of the SUV slammed shut, sealing them in the quiet, climate-controlled cabin. The transition from the oppressive, garlic-scented air of the club to the sterile leather of the car gave Maeve a moment of vertigo. The driver pulled away from the curb immediately, merging smoothly into the chaotic Manhattan traffic. Dominic unbuttoned his suit jacket, leaned back against the headrest, and closed his eyes. The tension in his jaw was visible, a hard ridge of muscle working beneath his skin. "Give it to me," Dominic said, his voice exhausted. What was the old man complaining about? My clothes? My youth? Did he call me a corporate bastard again? Maeve sat, holding the tablet. The cool glass felt slippery against her damp palms. She looked at Dominic, at the faint shadows of fatigue under his eyes. He thought this was a routine skimming operation. He thought this was just mob politics, a grumpy uncle stealing a few pennies from the till. She swallowed hard. The taste of anisette from the club's air still lingered on the back of her tongue. "He didn't complain about your clothes," Maeve said softly. Dominic opened his eyes, turning his head to look at her. He caught the shift in her tone instantly. The casual exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. What did he say? "He's not having customs issues," Maeve said, forcing her voice to remain steady. Container 404 isn't being held up. It's already cleared. Dominic's brow furrowed. Then what's in it? If it's not the electronics shipment, what did he bring in? Weapons. The word hung in the quiet cabin of the SUV, heavy and toxic. Dominic didn't move. He didn't blink. Explain. The capo, the young guy standing next to him, asked if they should move the rifles to the safe house. Maeve recited, her photographic memory replaying the guttural Calabrian syllables with terrifying clarity. Vincenzo told him to move them tonight. He told him to inform the Lupatazzi crew that the weapons are secure. Dominic's breathing stopped for a fraction of a second. The Lupatazzi family was his biggest rival across the river. A union between them and his uncle wasn't just a betrayal, it was a declaration of war. And? Dominic prompted, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. What else? Maeve looked away, staring out the tinted window at a woman pushing a stroller down the sidewalk. The normal world felt 1,000,000 miles away. He said they strike on Thursday. Maeve finished, her voice flat. At the dinner. Vincenzo said, he said the nephew won't leave the table breathing, and the ports will finally be his. Silence. It wasn't the tense, coiled silence of the boardroom 3 days ago. It was a suffocating, heavy silence, like the air right before a severe thunderstorm breaks. Dominic reached forward and tapped the glass partition separating them from the driver. It slid down with a soft, mechanical hum. Pull over, Dominic ordered. Boss, we're in the middle of... Pull the car over right now. The driver swerved into a loading zone, throwing the SUV into park. Partition up, Dominic commanded. The glass slid back into place, sealing them in absolute privacy. Dominic didn't look at Maeve. He reached into the hidden compartment built into the center console and pulled out a crystal decanter of bourbon and a single glass. His hands, usually so steady, so perfectly controlled, were betraying him. There was a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his fingers as he poured the amber liquid. He didn't drink it. He just held the glass, staring at the dark wood paneling of the seat back in front of him. Maeve watched him. She expected rage. She expected him to punch the window, to shout orders, to immediately start calling in hitmen. That's what Grigori would have done. Instead, Dominic looked hollowed out. He taught me how to tie my shoes, Dominic said. The words slipped out quietly, spoken to the empty air rather than to Maeve. When my father went to prison, Vincenzo took me to my first baseball game. He bought me my first suit. The vulnerability in the confession struck Maeve harder than any threat could have. It was raw, bleeding humanity from a man she had assumed was carved from ice. She looked at her own hands, resting on the expensive wool of her trousers. Internal contradictions warred inside her chest. She was a cleaner, a survivor. She had spent her entire life building walls to keep people like Dominic Rossi out. She shouldn't care that a mob boss was having a bad day. She shouldn't feel this strange, magnetic pull of empathy toward a man who casually ordered violence to protect his cargo. But as she looked at him, she didn't see a monster. She saw a man realizing that the only safety net he had ever known was actually a garrote wire wrapped around his throat. Family is just blood, Dominic, Maeve said softly. The cynicism in her voice wasn't an attack. It was a twisted form of comfort. It doesn't mean loyalty. It just means they know exactly where to slip the knife. Dominic turned his head slowly. He looked at her. Really looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He saw the scars of her past in her eyes, the transit camps, the hunger, the betrayals she had never spoken of but carried in the tight set of her shoulders. You've been cut before, he observed quietly. Enough times to know that you don't bleed out for people who hold the knife. Maeve replied, holding his gaze without flinching. Dominic stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the glass of bourbon in his hand. He poured it back into the decanter, capped it, and put it away. When he looked back up, the vulnerability was gone. The crack in the armor had been sealed from the inside, replaced by a cold, terrifying resolve. He tapped the partition glass. It lowered. "Drive," Dominic told the driver. "Call Arthur. Tell him to mobilize the ghost unit. We have a container to intercept in Newark tonight." He hit the button to raise the glass again, then turned to Maeve. "You're coming to dinner on Thursday," Dominic said. It wasn't a request. Maeve felt a chill race up her spine. "I thought the point was to stop the dinner." "No," Dominic said, a lethal calm settling over his features. "The point is to let him sit down to eat, and you're going to sit right next to him." Thursday night smelled like roasted garlic, fresh rosemary, and impending death. The private dining room at Il Sogno was a masterpiece of old-world opulence. Frescoes of Tuscan vineyards painted the ceiling, and a massive chandelier cast a warm golden glow over the long mahogany table. The room was soundproofed, insulated from the bustling restaurant beyond the double oak doors. Maeve sat to Dominic's immediate right. She was wearing a high-necked black velvet dress that Arthur had delivered to her apartment that morning. It felt heavy, like mourning clothes. Around the table sat 8 men. Vincenzo sat at the head, directly opposite Dominic. His slick-haired capo, Leo, sat to his left. The other men were Vincenzo's loyalists, men who had smiled at Dominic their entire lives while quietly plotting to bury him. The waiters, men Maeve recognized as Dominic's top enforcers, dressed in white aprons, had just cleared the pasta course. The main course was coming. "A beautiful spread, Dom," Vincenzo said, lifting his glass of heavy Chianti. His face was flushed with wine and the adrenaline of his impending victory. He thought the rifles were safely stashed. He thought his Lupatazzi allies were waiting in the alley out back. "Only the best for family, Uncle," Dominic replied, his voice smooth as silk. He didn't touch his wine. Maeve's heart was beating so hard she felt physically nauseous. She kept her hands folded neatly in her lap, pressing her nails into her palms to ground herself. The texture of the velvet dress was soft, but the reality of the room was entirely jagged edges. Vincenzo looked at Maeve, a smirk playing on his thick lips. "And you brought the secretary again. She must be very skilled to get a seat at the family table." The men around the table chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Maeve didn't blush. She didn't look down. She met Vincenzo's gaze with dead, flat eyes. The survival instinct that had once told her to hide was gone, replaced by a cold, hardening armor. "She's indispensable," Dominic said softly. He checked his watch. It was 9 p.m. exactly. He looked up, meeting his uncle's eyes. "Tell me about the container in Newark, Vincenzo." Vincenzo waved a dismissive hand. "I told you it cleared. The electronics are safe in the warehouse. The customs boys took their envelope and went home." "Electronics." Dominic repeated the word slowly, tasting it. "Yes." Vincenzo's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of unease crossing his features. "Why?" The double oak doors at the end of the room opened. Arthur walked in. He wasn't wearing a waiter's apron. He was wearing his heavy overcoat, and he was carrying a long black canvas duffel bag. The room instantly tensed. Leo, the capo, slipped his hand under his suit jacket. "Keep your hands on the table, Leo," Dominic commanded. The quietness of his voice vanished, replaced by the absolute metallic authority of a don. Leo froze. 2 of the waiters standing by the walls smoothly produced suppressed pistols from beneath their aprons, aiming them directly at the back of Leo's head. Vincenzo half stood, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "What is the meaning of this, Dominic? Have you lost your mind? Arthur walked to the center of the table, grabbed the bottom of the canvas bag, and upended it. 4 matte black military-grade assault rifles clattered onto the pristine white tablecloth, knocking over a crystal wine glass. A dark stain of Chianti bled across the white linen, looking exactly like the blood Maeve used to scrub out of the carpets. Vincenzo stared at the rifles. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. He looked at the guns, then at Dominic, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Customs must have missed these when they inspected the electronics. Dominic said, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fire. Dom, I can explain. Vincenzo stammered, his gravelly voice suddenly thin and reedy. This is a setup. The Lupatazis aren't waiting in the alley, Uncle. Dominic interrupted. Arthur paid them a visit 3 hours ago. They decided their alliance with you was a poor investment. They went home. Vincenzo fell back into his chair. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his track jacket. The realization that he was entirely outplayed, entirely trapped, washed over him. He looked around the room frantically, realizing his own men were paralyzed by Dominic's enforcers. Then his eyes landed on Maeve. He remembered the social club. He remembered the broken tablet. Puttana! Vincenzo spat, the thick Calabrian dialect tearing from his throat in pure, unadulterated hatred. You told him! You understood! He hurled a string of vile, violent curses in the dialect, damning her, calling her a street rat, a spy, a whore who had poisoned his nephew's mind. He used words meant to diminish her, to strip away the velvet dress and reduce her to nothing. Dominic reached for the gun holstered at his waist. Before he could draw it, Maeve leaned forward. She placed her hands flat on the mahogany table, right next to the spilled wine. She looked at the man who had ordered her death 3 days ago. The fear was completely gone. In its place was a cynical, absolute power that she hadn't known she possessed. Voi vecchi pensate di essere gli unici a sapere come nascondervi al buio, Maeve said. You old men think you're the only ones who know how to hide in the dark. Her Calabrian was flawless. The heavy consonants, the swallowed vowels, the brutal rhythm. She weaponized his own language against him, driving it into his chest like a stake. Vincenzo gasped, physically recoiling as if she had slapped him. Siete lenti? Maeve continued, her voice devoid of any warmth, dripping with the ice she had learned from Dominic. Siete avidi, e ora siete finiti. You are slow, you are greedy, and now you are finished. The silence in the dining room was absolute. The men around the table stared at the woman in the black velvet dress in complete shock. Dominic looked at her. A slow, dark satisfaction settled into his features. He didn't need to shoot Vincenzo right now. Maeve had just executed the man's pride, stripping away the last illusion of his power in front of his own crew. Take them out the back, Dominic told Arthur, not taking his eyes off his uncle. Arthur grabbed Vincenzo by the collar of his jacket, hauling the old man to his feet. Leo and the others were disarmed, and Frog marched toward the kitchen exit. Vincenzo didn't fight. He looked broken, his eyes fixed on the spilled wine on the table as he was dragged away into the night. When the doors clicked shut, only Maeve and Dominic were left in the room, surrounded by the ruins of the feast. Maeve sat back in her chair. The adrenaline crash hit her, but it wasn't like the one in the boardroom. Her knees didn't buckle. She didn't want to scrub the floor. She picked up her glass of water and took a slow, steady sip. Dominic watched her. He reached out, his hand resting near hers on the table. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from his knuckles was a brand. You didn't just translate, Dominic said quietly. You broke him. He was already broken, Maeve said, staring at the discarded rifles on the table. "I just translated the pieces." She looked at her reflection in the dark, polished wood of the table. The woman looking back at her was no longer a cleaner. She was a weapon. She had traded her faded smock for velvet and silk, her dirty water for spilled wine. She belonged to the dark now. And God help her. As she looked across the table at the man who had pulled her into it, she realized she didn't want to leave. That is the end of Maeve and Dominic's explosive story. From a forgotten cleaner scrubbing blood off the floor to the most dangerous woman in the Rossi syndicate, Maeve proved that true power isn't about holding the loudest gun. It's about understanding the quietest whispers. Did you expect her to completely shatter Vincenzo using his own dying dialect? Let us know your favorite twist in the comments below. If you loved this gripping mafia drama, smash that like button, share this video with your fellow story lovers, and hit subscribe. Turn on notifications so you never miss our next upload.